History, a premier and paramount priority for progress of a people. Arguably the single most important cultural property. It is the great unifier of all societies, from classical to contemporary. It is the shining beacon that restores vision to the blind. It is imperative that we create a unified effort to learn from it, that we may emulate its successes and prevent repeating its mistakes. For without history, we are without purpose. We are without identity. Welcome to the gray area, where we examine history in hindsight. January 14th, 1784, the United States ratifies a peace treaty with England, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. 1868, South Carolina Constitutional Convention, the first official assembly in the West with a black majority, met in the Charleston Clubhouse with 76 black delegates and 48 white delegates. 2/3 of the black delegates were former slaves. 1895, blacks organized the National Steamboat Company in Washington, D.C. The company sailed a steamboat, the George Leary, between D.C. and Norfolk, Virginia. The luxury boat held a capacity of 1,500 passengers and included 3 decks, 64 staterooms on 100 berths, and a dining. 1954, the Hudson Motor Car Company merged with Nash Kelvinator. The new company was called American Motor Corporation, or AMC, the makers of the Gremlin, likely history's ugliest car. 1963, George Wallace, who gained national notoriety for his anti-civil rights stand, who made the statement, "Segregation now, segregation forever," became governor of Alabama. 1972, Sanford and Son first premieres on NBC, which gained immediate popularity, depicting an African-American father and son engaging in the junkyard business. 1998, researchers report an enzyme that has the ability to slow the aging process and cell death. 1999, the impeachment trial of then U.S. President Bill Clinton began. Also that same year, on that same day, the U.S. proposed the lifting of the UN ceilings on the sale of Iraqi oil, the restriction being that the money be used to buy medicine and food for the Iraqi people. It is what's known as a structural adjustment agreement. 2011. In the December of 2010, a college student who worked as a street vendor set himself on fire in the city of Sidi Bouzid to protest unemployment, corruption, and the continued police state. A spat of other protesters followed and spread throughout the country. As many as 10,000 people took to the streets of Tunis, the capital city of Tunisia. President Ben Ali attempted to quell the protests with a promise of new elections, but not until 2014, and the creation of 300,000 jobs. But the demonstrations continued, and the police retaliated with live gunfire, batons, and tear gas. As many as 80 protesters died in the violence, were slaughtered. After 23 years in power, Ben Ali stepped down and left the country on this day in 2011. But rewinding all the way back to 1741, on this day, Benedict Arnold was born. Benedict Arnold was an American general during the Revolutionary War. But during the Revolutionary War, Benedict Arnold was instrumental in fending off British invaders from Virginia and Philadelphia and Lake Champlain. But the story is actually centered around what would become his wife, Margaret Shippen, the youngest daughter of Edward Shippen IV and Margaret Frances, were both from a line of British aristocrats. Being born in a prominent Philadelphia family, which included 2 Philadelphia mayors and the founder of Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. Her father, Edward Shippen, was a judge and member of the Provincial Council of Pennsylvania, who was considered either a neutralist or a covert Tory with allegiance to the British Crown. It's important to note that a Tory is a person who maintains the political philosophy of Toryism, which is the idea of supremacy of social order, summed up by priority, God, Queen, and country, which is the British version of conservatism, which is what American conservatism is based on. But moving forward, in the late summer of 1778, Margaret Shippen met Benedict Arnold, who was the Continental Military Commander of Philadelphia, and he began courting her despite the differences between him and her father, Edward Shippen, Arnold being a colonial soldier and Shippen being a loyalist, redcoat supporter. He would ask for her hand in marriage, but we'll get to that. But Judge Shippen thought that despite being a military commander, that he was too low-born for his daughter. In fact, in 1779, the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, which Edward Shippen IV, Margaret Shippen's father, sat on, had brought 8 formal charges against Benedict Arnold for corruption and malfeasance with the money of the federal and state governments, and he was subsequently convicted on 2 relatively minor offenses. The reality is Benedict Arnold was given charge of an impoverished military command. However, despite very few resources, Arnold proved a resourceful military leader who was described as a, quote, thorn in the redcoats' hindquarters, end quote. However, he would use federal and state money that was supposed to be used for state projects to ensure his soldiers were fed and ships and artillery were maintained and fully stocked. It was often said of him that, quote, he was poor, but he was prepared, end quote. Arnold's command on many occasions, suffered internal strife, poorly paid soldiers, low morale, despite their many victories against the British, even becoming so desperate at one point that he even asked for financial assistance from Edward Shippen IV at the behest of Margaret Shippen, who he was courting. It was rumored a proposition was made by Edward Shippen IV, who was loyal to the British Crown, to Benedict Arnold for his then 17-year-old daughter's hand in marriage and all the support he needed. But he had to perform the task of weakening the defenses at West Point Base for a British invasion. Shippen eventually granted permission for Benedict Arnold and his daughter Margaret to marry, which took place in the spring of 1779, specifically April 8th. However, in May of 1779, not long after he was newly married to Margaret, Arnold hired Joseph Stansbury to initiate communications offering his services to the British. General Clinton of the British Royal Army gave then Major Andre orders to pursue the possibility, and secret communications began between Andre and Arnold. The messages that they exchanged were sometimes transmitted through Margaret's actions, letters written in her handwriting, but also included coded communications written by Benedict Arnold in invisible ink. Benedict Arnold resigned his command in March of 1779. He is given the blessing to marry Edward Shippen IV's daughter in April. They marry in May. However, by that time, pursuant to the secret communications with the British, he sought and obtained the command of West Point, a critical American defense post in the highlands of the Hudson River. Peggy and their infant son, Edward Shippen Arnold, born 19 March 1780, joined him there in a home on the Hudson 2 miles south of West Point. General Arnold systematically weakened the defenses of West Point with the intent of making it easier for the British to capture. However, before facing prosecution, Benedict Arnold flees to the British, then returns in January the next year, specifically January 5th, as one of his tasks was to burn Richmond, Virginia to the ground. While a part of the British Army, he began to raise his own loyalist troops and was sent to Virginia with 1,600 men to aid General Cornwallis in his attempt to take over the southern states. He returned to England before the end of the war, where he and Margaret were reunited, and they both remained there until their deaths. Arnold's biographer Nathaniel Philbrick argues it was likely that Judge Edward Shippen IV and Margaret Shippen did have significant roles in the plot. While no direct evidence can be tracked back to Margaret's father, Margaret herself, however, exerted powerful influence on her husband, Benedict Arnold, who is said to have been his own man, quote unquote, but who actually was swayed by his staff and most certainly greatly influenced by his wife, as she did come from a loyalist family in Philadelphia, and she had many ties to the British, and she acted as a conduit for information to the British. There is something to be learned of Benedict Arnold's story. Here is an example of how women have the capacity to sway powerful men to do things they would not otherwise think a possibility. But it also displays how economic instability can make already desperate situations even worse. Benedict Arnold was put in charge of an economically disadvantaged command with limited resources and companies of men with low morale, stemming from the inability to properly sustain themselves and their family. He faced threats and rumors of would-be mutinies and constant acts of insubordination by his men, who grew frustrated with no pay at times and continued unkept promises of greater compensation at the end of the war, made by none other than George Washington himself. And furthermore, he married a woman who was clearly out of his league, who had more money than him, more status than him. However, though in Benedict Arnold's time, that dynamic, though not common, it speaks to a certain phenomenon that has occurred in contemporary society, in which women have the capacity to provide in many aspects for themselves and by their own efforts. Again, though uncommon back in those days, when the dynamic existed in which women possessed more than their men, they dealt with it. They dealt with the burden of performance, and that higher burden of performance was met with a greater level of effort. While today, the burden of performance is higher, and there is a certain contingent of men, instead of meeting the burden of performance, they cry and complain, which accomplishes nothing. Benedict Arnold's case also spells the consequence of dealing with women that are not only out of your league, but outside of your community. Benedict Arnold's community was that of the colonialists, and the woman he desired was a British loyalist with intimate ties to the Crown of England. The cost of her hand in marriage and gain access to her father's wealth and resources came at a high price, i.e. the destruction of his own community. The moral of the story is, no matter what community you're a part of, no community just accepts you without you giving up something or performing in the benefit of the community. You see, history, much like time, waits for no man. It is ultimately up to us to decide whether we choose to make it or be the reason we repeat it. However, no matter what side of it that you stand on, you can only learn from it by looking at history in hindsight.